Hello, I'm John Molesky, and this is Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My guest today is Michael Collins. Michael is Executive Director Americas for the Institute for Economics and Peace. And just this week, IEP released its 17th edition of an annual report called the Global Peace Index. And I'll tell you a little preview. The news is not good around the world. Michael joins us to discuss the findings. Michael, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me, John.
So before we dive into the findings, now let me ask you about the tradition of the now 17-year tradition of publishing the Global Peace Index. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so it's an annual report that we produce. In fact, the report itself was produced before the Institute was. So the report was published for the first time, like you say, about 17 years ago. And at the time, there really was no measurement of peacefulness around the world, at least one that, tried to do it in a comprehensive manner. So in many ways, this was kind of sort of the first attempt to do this from a data-driven perspective. Peace is, often something that's thought about as something sort of, fluffy or marshmallowy or difficult to measure. So the whole aim of this was to essentially develop a measurement of peace that enabled us to be able to sort of look at progress over time, including how well we are doing in helping build peacefulness worldwide and also regionally as well.
So Michael, what are the metrics? What are you measuring? I'm guessing it's more than just the absence of an overt conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are 23 indicators that we sort of track on an annual basis. Of course, there's a myriad of indicators, additional indicators that you could include. One of the inherent challenges is trying to sort of find something with global coverage if you're trying to develop a global report. So it covers 163 countries at the moment. That's about 99.7% of the world's population. Largely speaking, these 23 indicators fall in three domains. Ongoing conflict is one of them, of course, but also more internal measures of safety and security, as well as levels of militarization as well.
So I gave a little preview to our viewers of what to expect, but not only did peacefulness decline to its lowest level this century, as measured by conflict deaths, but it's deteriorated now for 9 straight years, which came as a bit of a surprise to me, frankly, because we would assume there's been a deterioration since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but this decline was in place even before then.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you noted, John, the deterioration last year specifically was quite severe. So 96% increase in conflict deaths, just to give you one example. That's heavily driven, obviously, by Russia and Ukraine. But one of the key points that we make in this report is actually deaths from Ethiopia actually eclipsed, to a certain extent, deaths that we're currently seeing coming out of the Ukraine. But from a trends perspective, yes, unfortunately, it is bad news in that sense. Last year, we already reported that overall levels of peacefulness around the world were the lowest that we'd ever seen since the inception of the index. This year is the most deadly, specifically, and is deteriorating in peacefulness for pretty much every year except 3 over the last 15 years as well. So although you kind of sort of look at peacefulness on a year-on-year basis, you tend to see a bit of noise. This definitely forms part of a larger trend.
And I think it was 79 countries that experienced an increase in conflict in just the past year.
That's right, yes. 84 countries that improved in peacefulness, 79 countries that didn't. But this kind of sort of underscores how those deteriorations in peace are actually a lot larger than improvements in peace that invariably are.
And how does that compare to other years? Is that a typical number of countries who slide either forward or backward, or are we in an accelerated time of a lack of peacefulness?
So it does tend to cycle through, and it kind of sort of very much depends how you cut and chop the data. One of the sort of key sort of points of interest, I'd say, with regards to that is actually what we're kind of sort of calling the increase of internationalized conflict. So actually, that's the number of countries who are participating in external conflicts or offering proxy support to other countries. So that's up to 90, I believe, this year, compared to just over 50 in 2008. Again, an indication of countries' willingness, essentially, to participate in different measures in different conflicts around the world.
So NATO's support of Ukraine would, I guess, be one of those examples. What other notable examples are there in this so-called internationalization?
Yeah, so that would be one example. Of course, you could also support of, say, Russia and China in the case of Myanmar, for example, involvement of Saudi Arabia and Iran in Yemen. And the involvement of Russia, for example, in this case in Mali. But of course, it would have been France prior to that.
Does the analysis indicate why we're seeing this trend?
So, again, we kind of sort of open up the question and try and provide as much framing as we possibly can. If from a conjecture point of view, I think a variety of different things. The technological changes that we've seen, I think, around the world are significant, and we see that impacting different measures of peacefulness that we have, both from what we call the negative and the positive peace perspective. One of the things that we highlight in this year's report is, for example, the increased use of drones. We've gone from kind of sort of the use of, extremely expensive, very large unmanned aerial vehicles used by primarily the world's leading powers, to these drones being used in conflicts throughout the world by both state groups and non-state groups as well, and drones that are significantly cheaper, $20,000 or less. Sometimes even the drones that you would see, in the supermarket. You actually see a lot of the footage coming out of the Ukraine, for example, using this kind of drones as well. So I think all of these components, actually, to a certain degree, are facilitating that kind of involvement, as well as the variety of different sort of cyber attack tools that we now have, and financial tools as well.
I know that you're measuring both the human toll and the economic toll of this, and you just mentioned drones, the impact of technology. Talk to us about the former, the human toll. What are some of the things you're seeing in terms of loss? There was one statistic I pulled from the findings you shared with me that was stunning. 65% of men in Ukraine aged 20 to 24 have either fled the country or died in conflict. 65%. And what that might say about the future of Ukraine when hostilities end. Could you tell us more about your findings in that regard, about the human toll of this carnage?
Yeah, absolutely. And with your permission, I'd sort of like to extend that globally as well. I mean, one of the things that we're seeing is this ongoing, as a trend, increase in levels of amounts of refugees as well as IDPs around the world, very much mimicking this increase in conflict. So that's a consideration there. Ethiopia, 60% of the population of Syria continues to be displaced to this day, for example. Similar percentages in Ukraine right now. Yes, it's absolutely true what you mentioned about men. All those percentages are similar for women. I'd say that actually speaks more potentially to the dearth of ability of fighting bodies, right, in terms of how the war would sort of play out essentially over the next 3 to 6 months. But yes, considerable amounts of displacement, not only in Ukraine and Russia, but around the world as well.
And the economic toll as well. Absolutely.
So every year, as part of the Global Peace Index, what we do is we calculate the economic cost of violence. This year totals $17.5 trillion. That's a 6.6, I believe, increase in overall economic cost of violence over the last year. Interestingly, in terms of levels of military expenditure, for example. So this estimate does include levels of investments in violent containment. So it does include military expenditure, for example. We have actually seen, on average, the military expenditure has decreased around the world in terms of percentage of GDP. It has increased in terms of overall number. And that includes all of the major superpowers, the permanent five, for example. But interestingly, military expenditure per GDP has actually reduced, with the exception of Russia.
So your focus is on the Americas. What does the picture look like in the Western Hemisphere?
So overall, the peacefulness has deteriorated in both Central America as well as South America as well. It's actually improved in Northern America, although that's kind of sort of a bit of a blip of the data, because it only includes 2 countries, the United States and Canada. Peacefulness improved in Canada, deteriorated slightly in the United States, essentially improving levels of criminality in Canada, trumped deteriorating levels of criminality in the United States right now.
So 84 countries improved. Iceland, the most peaceful, followed by Denmark, Ireland, New Zealand, Austria. What can we learn from places where peace is more the norm than conflict?
So one of the exercises that IEP does that we don't explain in detail in the Global Peace Index, but the Global Peace Index is actually the basis for this measurement, is our work on what we call positive peace. So if you imagine that on the left-hand side, you have sort of a ranking of countries based on their levels of peacefulness using the metrics that we talked about before, what you can do then is you can run a variety of forms of statistical analysis to be able to better understand the underlying institutions, attitudes, and structures that create and sustain peace. So we do tend to see, for example, that the most peaceful nations, I mean, you mentioned a few there, John, but of course there's a whole kind of sort of, list and ranking of peaceful nations, as well as improvements in peace as well. For example, Libya, who doesn't particularly factor well in terms of ranking in the Global Peace Index, is nonetheless the country that's improved most in peacefulness over the last 2 years. But these more peaceful countries, or countries improving in peace, tend to show improvements in well-functioning government, equitable distribution of resources, free flow of information, good relations with neighbors, high levels of human capital, acceptance of the rights of others, low levels of corruption, and sound business environment. These are essentially what we call the 8 pillars of positive peace. Again, statistically tied. As and when these things improve systemically, we see subsequent improvements in peacefulness around the world.
And those 8 pillars you just described, in large part, describe the EU, and as a region, Europe remains largely peaceful, relatively speaking.
Yes, that is right. So Europe has been the most peaceful sort of region since the inception of the index. Now, I should note that the Ukraine, for example, isn't included as a region here. It's included in the Russia-Eurasia region. So we are talking more about the EU, as you noted, John. Although it has seen deteriorations in peacefulness, both in terms of political instability. Violent demonstrations in Europe right now this year are down, but are up as an overall trend, as well as levels of criminality as well. But for the most part, Europe is and has been one of the most peaceful regions, the most peaceful region around the world.
When you look at the threats or the issues that the world is facing, I think existentially speaking, climate change, and I think in recent years, the pandemic, when you look at the index over the last several years, do you see a direct correlation between increases in severe weather, or certainly the pandemic itself as a singular event? Do they have a negative impact on peacefulness?
So there's a parallel body of work that we incorporate certain components into the Global Peace Index, but it's also broken out separately, called the Ecological Threat Report. And that in itself looks at levels of conflict compared to food security, water stress, as well as rapid population growth and natural disasters as well. So broadly speaking, yes, we do see a correlation with all of these things, as, when, and if food security, water stress, rapid population growth, and natural disasters increase, so does conflict. Conflict leads also to the opposite of that as well. Afghanistan is kind of sort of the unfortunate case of the country that is the least peaceful country in the world right now, and has been for quite some time, and also subject to a variety of what we call these ecological threats. The connections with climate change specifically are more hard to make, which is why we prefer to talk about ecological threats specifically in terms of what we can measure.
You mentioned Afghanistan as the least peaceful country, and that bottom 5, Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, South Sudan, DR Congo. But the report also says there has been improvement in Afghanistan and Syria. I'm guessing that's around the margins, and that we're not talking about significant improvement for the people on the ground.
No, actually, we are seeing significant improvement, although it is very much related to a single metric in the case of Afghanistan, for example. So what we saw is a significant decrease in levels of conflict with the US troop withdrawal in August of last year. In fact, it's quite radical if you look at it from a graphics perspective. But of course, that's not to say that the situation has necessarily improved on the ground in other ways. In the case of Syria, one of the things that we've seen is an ongoing improvements in levels of in the impact of terrorism. For example, we've seen a lot of terrorism has gradually shifted towards sub-Saharan Africa, and in particular the Sahel. So Syria is an area that, notwithstanding starting from a very low base, is an area where we started to see improvements in peace.
So you're describing a bit of a shell game there, where even though there's an improvement somewhere, it doesn't mean that there's an overall improvement, because often the problem is just moving to a different location.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And it's also, for example, the case in just bringing, and yes, so geographically, absolutely. And terrorism is a very good example of this. And in the case of Afghanistan, and within a specific country also. So, for example, right now another report that we produced, which also feeds into the Global Peace Index, is the Global Terrorism Index. The Taliban right now are not, counted as a terrorist organization. So if you look at it on paper, you see an improvement in terrorism. But nonetheless, the Taliban themselves are continuing to receive and there continue to be a high number of terrorist attacks in the country, in this case from the Khorasan chapter of ISIS and other different sort of groups that are beginning to operate there. So yes, very much a sort of a shift in the types of violence and the actors as well.
One of the obvious outcomes of violence is people on the move, right? Refugees. What the report tells us is that 15 countries have more than 5% of their population displaced. That number sounds high to me on the surface, but if you could provide us with some historical context as you've tracked this over the course of years, where is that trending, and is that an alarmingly high number?
Yeah, so I mean, any displacement, of course, is unfortunate and alarming. In terms of sort of broad metrics, what I'd say is that for the most part, displacement happens internally. So that in itself is tremendously difficult to manage within a country, but at the same time, it does not have the impact that sort of an external displacement would have. So I believe only 1 in 5 people who are displaced actually take the journey that would be an international journey to another country. So levels of internal displacement are significantly higher than measures of international refugees. The largest flow of refugees that we sort of saw in terms of a spike would have been immediately after Syria and Afghanistan as well, when we saw the massive influx of refugees in Europe. That was about 2015, I believe. In terms of sort of spike, we've seen that go, but overall, as an overall metric around the world, we continue to see that increase. There are very different estimates that are sort of circulated in terms of both refugees and IDPs. I believe our estimate is about 80 million for refugees and 30 million for IDPs.
About those estimates, how reliable are the numbers when it comes to, say, deaths in conflict? We know that Russia has been very tight-lipped about the number of losses that it's endured. How confident can you be in the numbers that you're tracing or you're tracking?
Yeah, absolutely. So, it's difficult to be confident in any one of these measures. We do our due diligence, and we're actually very conservative in the numbers that we choose. So I think the ranges and estimates in terms of deaths in the Ukraine right now from both sides range anywhere from 20,000 to about 400,000. So the 80,000 estimate that we use is one that we have relatively high levels of confidence in. But again, it is challenging to be able to do, especially with data that's so new. For example, the Ethiopia data that we've had access to is relatively recent. Major media blackouts there, and potentially a reason why Ethiopia hasn't been talked about more. Again, the impact that we've seen in terms of overall deaths is potentially higher than what we would see in the Ukraine now. Now, as and when the Global Peace Index is updated annually, what we're able to do is to incorporate the data that has become available since. So any metrics that are included now are subsequently revised as and when new information becomes available.
So, Michael, earlier you mentioned that you're attempting with the index to present the data in the most objective manner possible and not getting into conjecture or analysis. Does the report, as a result of that, contain anything that we could describe as recommendations?
So yes, it is true, John, that we try and maintain a neutral language in all cases, understanding that all of these issues are not only systemic, but also tremendously complex. As well as a great variety of cultural values around the world. So we do tend to not try and jump into the fray and share opinion, rather to kind of sort of paint an overall landscape. I would like to kind of sort of refer perhaps again to our positive peace work, which looks into the underlying attitudes, institutions, and structures that create and sustain peace. What we do through our work is provide a variety of different kind of sort of consulting services to both development organizations and countries to be able to better understand where different countries are ranking in terms of these underlying socioeconomic and attitudinal metrics, and what are the potential opportunities to be able to create and sustain peace over time. So, you're down in Washington, D.C., obviously, John. USAID is committed to supporting 10 countries around the world as part of the Global Fragility Act, and we're very much in the fray there, trying to find ways of presenting data that may be useful to help build peace in those regions.
Well, the entire report is interesting and speaks for itself, but one of the really interesting angles is you talk about a what-if scenario. What if there were an economic blockade of Taiwan, and what the implications would be? Could you tell us about that, what your findings are in that regard?
So yeah, absolutely. Now, as part of the sort of the annual cost of economic cost of violence work that we do in the report, we chose to sort of do a sort of a case study or scenario, like you mentioned, John, specifically on the impact of a maritime blockade on Taiwan. So this is different from conflicts between Taiwan and China, and it's also more expansive than something that would focus specifically, let's say, on the semiconductor industry as well. So we've tried to do an estimate across all different kinds of trade. Overall, we see that over the first year, a maritime blockade on Taiwan would have an economic impact of $2.7 trillion. That's in the first year. That's about 2.8% of the world's GDP, double the impact of the global financial crisis in 2008. So something that would be significant. That's only in terms of, direct metrics. If you were to then think kind of sort of what the supply chain constraints, similar to what we saw in COVID, would be further down the line, that impact would be significant. Other considerations which aren't factored into that total amount are things, for example, like the impact on foreign investment, the investments that China has in various places. The economic cost that we estimate does include both the blockade, but also the likelihood of the impact of sanctions on China, for example. Just in closing, John, with regards to that piece of research specifically, of course, it's highlighted. We jump into it in detail in the report, but we do see quite a bit of regional impact. Places like Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, and all major trade partners, but heavily reliant on China in many ways. Australia, just to give you an example, 30% of Australian trade is with China, so that would have a significant impact as well. In terms of total trade volume, obviously the United States is China's largest trade partner, but in terms of GDP and how that would impact the United States, it's relatively low.
So, Michael, I've been cherry picking findings that I thought were jumped out at me and were interesting for all kinds of reasons. But I'm wondering, is there anything I haven't asked you about that you think it's really important for people to know about that is contained in the current index?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of sort of snippets in that report. One of the things that stood out to me was perhaps the unmanned aerial vehicles and the use of drones. Because both, rather in addition to sort of the anecdotal evidence that we were talking about before, we actually see it in terms of overall drone strikes and drone deaths as well. So we've seen a decrease in the amount of drone deaths compared to drone strikes. Another indicator, for example, that the use of drones is becoming a lot more common, and specifically drones that are a lot cheaper as well. So probably not so much an answer or snippet, but rather the same question that you posed me at the beginning, John, which is what is the impact of technology, not only in terms of this, but also in terms of telecommunications all around the world. One of the open questions that we have, and somewhat of a paradox that we see when, again, I fold in this positive peace work that we do, is whereas we've seen an improvement, for example, in the strength of institutions around the world and some of these underlying metrics, socioeconomic metrics, what we call structures, so things like the poverty gap, for example, overall life expectancy, these things are improving. But nonetheless, the attitudes domain, the way that we're treating each other, the way that we're corresponding, and the quality of information that people are receiving has continued to deteriorate. So no doubt having a significant impact in peacefulness around the world, and here's proof of the pudding.
Michael, who's the primary audience for your report? Who do you hope sees it, and what do you hope they do in reaction to seeing it?
So we work with a variety of different multilateral organizations. We've also got partnerships with civil society organizations around the world, partnership with World Vision, with Rotary International, recently signed a partnership with the UN Office of Counterterrorism as well. Also working closely with USAID on a variety of this. In fact, I'm going to be down at USAID in Washington this Friday, presenting findings from the Global Peace Index, and again informing UN member states and any country about where they are in the index and what opportunities there are to build peace, John.
And where can people find the report?
So the report is available for free, as is an accompanying PowerPoint presentation on visionofhumanity.org, which is IEP's public portal. There is data available there, and the full methodology for the Global Peace Index is expanded on in the back of the report.
Well, Michael, thank you very much for joining us today. This has been fascinating, and congratulations on year number 17 of this important report.
Thank you very much, John. Really appreciate it.
Our guest has been Michael Collins, Executive Director of Americas for the Institute for Economics and Peace. And we encourage you to not just look at our Cliff Notes interview here, take a look at the entire report that's available to you free of charge online. We hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now, and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for your time and interest.